To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments by John Birch Society President Arthur Thompson is an historical overview of the first 100 years of America's existence, but it is also much more than this. The author explains that those who study history soon discover that its books do not always contain the whole story, often for reasons of economy or because the writer is unaware of certain facts. But historiography can also be restricted by the selection process due to social or political bias, an agenda, or simply because it serves the interests of those in power. This obviously distorts the truth to such an extent that over time it can be weaponized against entire peoples and nations. As Orwell candidly stated, the most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. In addition to these distortions in the historical record, can be added the intentional dumbing of a people to break its cultural cohesion. A quarter of all American college graduates are unable to find the Pacific Ocean on an unlabeled map of the world. Even the facility to use and understand the English language has fallen on hard times. The vocabulary of the average young person has dwindled alarmingly, and a diminishing vocabulary greatly reduces one's ability to critically understand the issues of the present and, therefore, how they relate to the past. Thus, it is no wonder that the control of education has long been a major objective for those desiring revolutionary social change in America. Another component misrepresenting the past is the regulation of the publishing and distribution of historical works. Of course, there are independent publishers, but financial pressures limit the promotion and publicity of their output, nor do their publications receive favorable reviews in major news streams. As Thompson points out, the books of John A. Stormer, such as None Dare Call It Treason, sold tens of millions of copies in the 60s and 70s, but despite this widespread readership, none received any serious notice in the mass media. To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments, then, is broad and detailed in scope, but its examination of the period between American independence and the U.S. Civil War, however, is particularly illuminating as an historiographical study. In the decades following independence, conspirators and radicals wished to propel America in the direction followed by the revolutionary socialist regimes of France, with bloody exterminations of political opponents and highly centralized government. Thompson asserts that the American War for Independence produced a country that in many respects was the opposite of what would have been produced by the French Revolution. It became a struggle between two opposing forces, of good and evil, manifested in their forms of rule, and as a result, a struggle over the West's geography and peoples that the New and Old World models would govern. The American Revolution aimed not at the destruction of the social system of colonial America. It aimed simply to guarantee that English Americans would enjoy all of the rights of other Englishmen. But due to the intransigence of an indebted, tax-driven British government at that time, this expectation could only come through independence. The French Revolution, by contrast, operated solely under a desire to dismantle the traditional culture of France. The French Revolution was primarily the product of an atheistic, clandestine group known as the Illuminati, the wealthy members of which opposed Christianity, who sought to replace European cultures with a godless form of material despotism, wrapped in the banners of egalitarianism and fraternity. Agenteurs from Europe, including many from the French revolutionary government, worked incessantly to accomplish similar objectives in America, often using inflammatory rhetoric to incite rebellion and chaos. These men reserved a special hostility, however, to the Founding Fathers, and particularly towards President Washington, who was conservative in outlook and a constitutionalist in his governance. By placing strict limits on political power, the Constitution was especially detested by these people. Through numerous European-backed factions, it was hoped that a mass insurrection could eventually be fomented, as in revolutionary France, where explosions of mob violence had brought radicals into power. And as Thompson notes, this nearly happened during the administration of John Adams. The insurrectionary activities of revolutionary agents in the early decades of American sovereignty, therefore, were very much the same as those experienced with the Soviet Union during the 20th century. Both worked to subvert and overthrow the legitimate government of the United States and to replace it with a socialist dictatorship. One example of such scheming was the politicization of the black slavery debate. Despite the existence of several million white indentured servants, many of whom filled the homes of rich Northerners with an endless supply of free labor. During the first half of the 19th century, the wedge issue of slavery was seized upon by the enemies of the Republic. Thompson states that the English peacefully abolished slavery in 1833, then provided some £20 million so that ex-slaves could be apprenticed in various trades, which was more reasonable than waging a civil war. Nor did this require the lives of nearly 1 million citizens to achieve, as it did in America. Extremists in the North, who were composed entirely of progressive liberals, that is to say socialists, in their outlook, not only opposed the free title possession of slaves, but private ownership of property as well. And as early as the 1840s, incendiary speeches in the city circuits and the publication of anti-Southern pamphlets began making the daily rounds. In 1859, the infamous John Brown launched a raid on a military armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to arm slaves after inciting a mass slave insurrection. Brown was duly captured, convicted of treason against the state of Virginia, then hanged. That, however, only served to escalate the growing acrimony. For the Northern abolitionists, Brown had become a martyr, whose death won an army of adherents to their cause, whereas in the South, thoughts of a Northern-directed slave rebellion sent shivers of horror through the entire populace, creating a deep feeling of enmity towards the North. And although the eventual causes for civil war were primarily economic, concerning tariffs, import taxes on industrial goods, and an unfair system of North-South textiles competition, the stigmatization of Southern ways of life had a tangible influence on the growing resentment between the two cultures. In reality, only a small percentage of the Southern population owned slaves, so it was not in the defense of slavery that 1 million Southerners enlisted, almost all of them being young men from poor backgrounds. It was simply from the desire to preserve their heritage from the incursions of the Northern industrial and banking magnates, who wanted to co-opt Southern independence into the greater notion of a highly federalized United States of America, and the spirit of this old republicanism moved them to action. And so it was that highly organized firebrands and agenteurs, operating on both sides, began calling for war. With the election of Lincoln in 1860, the fuse was lit, and the bloodiest war in American history achieved all the cultural goals of the socialist radicals. The South was utterly devastated, its social system completely overturned, state sovereignty totally undermined, and the process of ever greater federal centralization was set in motion. Arthur Thompson's book is a well-articulated example of objective, conservative historiography, and his extraordinary research on certain key figures and events in early American history is particularly illuminating. Throughout the work, present-day social trends are used as analogues, acting as a comparative history that gives new meaning to the cultural conditions we now face. From the very beginning, America represented a magnificent prize, coveted by the emissaries of those global and socialist forces that restlessly sought to master her. And if heritage Americans still love their republic and the legacy of its original intent, then they too will be relentless in repelling those forces of intrigue and deception that have surrounded her.